Imagine this. You're out there, just the vast, unforgiving Atlantic all around. A routine training mission, then suddenly a desperate cry crackles over the radio. We don't know which way is up. Everything's wrong, strange. Yeah. And then, just silence. Abrupt. Chilling. Not long after that, a search plane. Sent out specifically to find them, it vanishes too. Just gone. Adding this whole other layer of, well, terror to the emptiness, and later you hear about hundreds of souls on a huge cargo ship disappearing. Without a single trace, leaving nothing behind but, an empty ocean and this massive haunting question mark. For decades now, a particular part of the North Atlantic, usually drawn between Miami, Florida, the island of Bermuda way out there, and San Juan, Puerto Rico. Well, it's become completely synonymous with mystery, with the unexplained, with things that seem almost, supernatural. It's known, of course, as the Bermuda Triangle, or sometimes you hear it called the Devil's Triangle. It's this place where, in popular imagination anyway, ships and planes just blink out of existence, vanish into thin air, or get swallowed by the sea with no explanation. You've definitely heard the stories.
The endless books, the documentaries, all the intense conspiracy theories that have fueled this dark legend since, the middle of the 20th century. But in this deep dive, we're going to try and pull back that curtain. On the legend, I mean. Our mission today is really to separate the actual facts from this really elaborate, tangled web of fiction. We want to move past the sensational stuff that built the myth, and uncover the actual verifiable truth behind these really captivating, sometimes genuinely terrifying tales.
Yes, exactly. And we'll be meticulously looking at the real disappearances that have happened in this area. But maybe even more importantly, we'll explore the scientific, the logical explanations that, let's be honest, often get completely drowned out by all the myth-making and the dramatic stories. The central question we're really going to grapple with today isn't just what vanished in the Bermuda Triangle. It's more about what truly remains unsolved. Is the biggest mystery really about the fate of those specific ships and planes? Or perhaps, is it actually about how such a powerful, such a pervasive legend managed to dominate our collective imagination? How it's endured for, 70 years, despite having perfectly rational explanations available pretty much from the start. We're going to explore how this whole story reflects something pretty deep about us, about humans, our, innate tendency to look for supernatural answers, often much more exciting answers, for events that are actually natural, though, of course, still incredibly tragic.
Okay, right. Let's unpack that a bit, because the Bermuda Triangle story, the one we all kind of know today, it isn't some ancient maritime legend. It's not something passed down by sailors for centuries, whispered tales over flickering lanterns. Its origins are actually surprisingly recent. It's a genuinely modern myth. Forged right in the middle of the 20th century, the whole idea started to kind of take shape, not with ancient mariners fearing sea monsters, but remarkably, right after World War II. It really began to coalesce in the 1950s. That was a time, remember, of huge technological leaps, but also new ways for stories and maybe misinformation to spread really fast. And the very first public mention, that tiny spark that kind of unknowingly laid the groundwork for this global phenomenon, it actually showed up in the Miami Herald newspaper in 1950. It was just a brief article. Mentioned a few kind of strange disappearances in this particular bit of the Atlantic. Just think about that for a second. A simple newspaper piece highlighting a couple of incidents. And somehow that set the stage, maybe completely by accident, for what would become one of the most talked about, most enduring mysteries ever.
What was it about that initial idea, just that little suggestion of something unusual, that resonated so quickly even back then? What laid the sort of psychological groundwork for a bigger, juicier story to grab hold?
It is quite striking, isn't it, that the Miami Herald article was the initial spark. But the actual term Bermuda Triangle, that really chilling name that's become so instantly recognizable, that only appeared in print much later, in 1964. And that was a really pivotal moment for the legend. A writer named Vincent Gaddis, writing for Argosy magazine, published an article titled, very specifically, The Deadly Bermuda Triangle. Now, this wasn't just a passing mention. It was a much more deliberate attempt to compile and present a whole list of alleged disappearances. It brought widespread attention to the region in a way nothing had before. And Gaddis, he later expanded that article into a full book, Invisible Horizons, True Mysteries of the Sea, which really cemented the concept in the public mind.
Right. Gaddis really put the name on the map.
He did, and it raises that interesting question. How did just one magazine article, by one specific writer, managed to coin a term that became so incredibly iconic, that just spread everywhere across the globe? I think it says a lot about the sociocultural climate of the 1960s. That was a decade, remember, with a real explosion of interest in the unexplained, the paranormal, the fringes of science, UFOs, all that stuff. It was maybe an era just perfectly ripe for stories that offered an escape from the everyday, maybe even a bit of thrilling fear in a world that was changing so incredibly fast. That specific mix of timing, public fascination, and a really compelling, even if totally unproven narrative, it just made the story catch fire.
Yeah, the timing was perfect. And if Gaddis, like you said, lit the fuse, well, then Charles Berlitz basically poured jet fuel on it. The story gained even more momentum, really global infamy, with Berlitz's 1974 bestseller, also just called the Bermuda Triangle. Simple, direct. And what's really fascinating, maybe a bit telling, is that Berlitz, well, he was actually a linguist by training. He wasn't a scientific investigator, not a maritime expert, not an aviation guy, a linguist. Yet he put together this huge collection of disappearances, mysterious events, and he presented them not just as, intriguing puzzles, but as solid evidence. Evidence for supernatural forces or even, famously, extraterrestrial activity. His book wasn't just popular, it was a cultural phenomenon. Sold millions and millions of copies. Translated the myth into dozens of languages. It was everywhere. So why? Why did his sensational claims, which, let's be frank, often lacked any real scientific rigor, why did they capture the imagination of so many millions? Why did they cement the Bermuda Triangle in pop culture more than anything before?
I think it really highlights that powerful, almost irresistible mix of mystery, tragedy, and crucially, the massive influence of popular media. It shows us how quickly a really dramatic story, even if it's not really backed up by solid evidence, can take root, and how it can completely overshadow the more rational, maybe less exciting explanations.
Absolutely. It really speaks to our deep-seated human desire for a narrative, for a story that makes sense of chaos, even if that story involves, aliens or lost dimensions. And understanding exactly how this legend was built piece by piece, how it was carefully constructed and then amplified by certain authors in the media, that's absolutely crucial before we even start looking at the specific cases. Because the very origins of the story, steeped as they are in sensationalism rather than, say, objective analysis, they automatically color how we see every single incident that gets blamed on the triangle later on. It kind of predisposes us, the audience, you listening right now, to immediately look for the extraordinary explanation, to hunt for the unknown variable, even when the ordinary, often just tragic truth is right there, and much more grounded in reality. It's a really powerful testament to the allure of a good mystery. It doesn't matter if it's manufactured.
Okay, so we get how the legend was born and blew up. Now let's talk geography. Where exactly is this infamous region? You hear the boundaries thrown around all the time, but let's actually picture it. It's usually defined by connecting 3 points on a map. Miami in Florida, the island of Bermuda, way out in the mid-Atlantic, and San Juan down in Puerto Rico. Now, when you actually connect those dots on a nautical chart, you see it immediately. This isn't some tiny, weird, isolated corner of the ocean nobody goes near. It's a truly huge area, roughly 500,000 square miles of open water. Massive. And here's where it gets really interesting, and where the popular story starts to wobble a bit. Despite this ominous reputation, this exact area is, in reality, one of those heavily traveled shipping lanes and air corridors in the entire world. We're talking thousands upon thousands of ships every year. Huge container ships, oil tankers, luxury cruise liners, plus countless airplanes, commercial jets flying packed routes, private planes hopping between islands. It's constantly busy, day and night. So if it really were some kind of supernatural death trap, a place where vessels just wink out of existence way more often than they should, why is it also this incredibly bustling superhighway for global trade and tourism? That stark contrast right there, it immediately suggests that maybe the reality is a lot more mundane, a lot more statistical than the myth wants us to believe.
That's a key point. The simple fact is, this region, while yes, heavily trafficked, also has very real, very natural geographical features and meteorological conditions that pose genuine hazards. Hazards that are far more tangible, far more scientifically verifiable than any supposed paranormal force. Take the Gulf Stream, for example. It's one of the world's most powerful ocean currents, and it flows right through this area. It's like a massive river within the ocean. And it doesn't just create unpredictable weather patterns, which it definitely does, but it also generates extremely strong currents. They can reach speeds of like 5.6 miles per hour. Imagine trying to navigate a small boat or maybe an aircraft low on fuel in currents like that. It makes navigation incredibly difficult, especially for smaller craft or anything already having trouble. It could easily sweep them miles and miles off course very quickly.
Right, the currents alone are a huge factor. But then there's the weather. That's the really dramatic part, isn't it? This region is just notorious for sudden, incredibly violent storms. And we're not just talking about, bitter rain and wind. We're talking major hurricanes, intense tropical storms, and they can blow up with frightening speed and intensity. They can catch even large, well-equipped ships completely off guard. And it's not like this is a rare thing. The Atlantic hurricane season, officially June to November, sees frequent, often intense storm activity right in this very area. It's basically a known hotbed for volatile weather. A perfectly clear sky can turn into a raging tempest in just a few hours. That creates immediate life-threatening conditions right there.
And then if you think about what happens after something goes wrong, if a ship or plane does go down, well, the ocean depths themselves are another huge challenge. The Puerto Rico Trench, for instance. It's the deepest part of the entire Atlantic Ocean, plunging down over 27,000 feet. And it lies right within the traditional boundaries of the triangle. Now, combine that extreme depth with those powerful currents we just talked about, it makes search and rescue operations incredibly difficult, sometimes, frankly, impossible. When a vessel or an aircraft goes down in those conditions, especially if it breaks apart quickly on impact or in the storm, what happens? Well, the evidence, the wreckage, it's often lost forever. It gets scattered across miles of seabed, buried under sediment, or simply swept away beyond any hope of recovery. And then that very lack of physical evidence, that lack of discovery, ironically ends up fueling the mystery. It becomes a vanishing, when really it might just be a tragic consequence of the immense, unforgiving nature of the deep ocean. And beyond those major factors, we're also talking about other real documented natural phenomena. These aren't just theories. Things like rogue waves. These are exceptionally large, solitary waves that can appear almost out of nowhere, sometimes reaching heights of 100 feet or more, even in seas that aren't generally that rough at the time. They're caused by complex wave interactions. And they're real. They've been measured. They've been documented as the cause of countless maritime disasters throughout history, all over the world, not just here. And while maybe less relevant for the deep ocean disappearances, it's worth a quick mention. Closer to shore, within the triangle's broad boundaries, you also have things like plume holes, underwater sinkholes. These can create really treacherous local currents, sometimes even whirlpool effects near coastlines like the Bahamas. Again, real documented hazards, not paranormal.
Okay, so these aren't just vague possibilities. These are established, scientifically documented facts about the environment in that part of the Atlantic. Violent weather, strong currents, extreme depths, rogue waves. Understanding these real, tangible dangers really helps us look critically at those famous disappearances. The ones always blamed on supernatural stuff. It shifts the focus, doesn't it? Away from the mystical, away from aliens and time warps, and towards meteorology, oceanography, engineering limits, towards the actual documented forces of nature that have tragically claimed ships and lives all over the globe long before anyone drew a triangle on a map. Right. So now let's tackle the big ones, the cases that people always bring up as the most compelling proof for the Bermuda Triangle's spooky reputation. The stories whispered about, the ones that really grabbed the public imagination and cemented the legend. Probably the most famous case, the one everyone knows, is Flight 19. This is a group of 5 U.S. Navy torpedo bombers, Avenger aircraft, that disappeared on December 5, 1945. Think about it. 14 experienced airmen on what was supposed to be just a routine training flight. A standard exercise over the ocean. Right. Suddenly they're lost. Radio contact gets confused, desperate, then nothing. And then the really chilling part, a search and rescue plane set out to look for them, a huge Martin Mariner flying boat. It also disappeared, without a trace later that same day. That second disappearance just added this layer of terrifying, almost unbelievable mystery onto an already baffling situation. The stories that grew up around Flight 19 are wild. Alien abduction, time warps, portals opening up. But what if the truth, while still incredibly sad, is actually far more human?
That's exactly the question to ask. And when we do investigate thoroughly, when we look past the sensational headlines, what does the evidence actually show? Well, in the case of Flight 19, the reality, according to the official Navy investigation, is far more mundane, though, as you say, undeniably tragic. The flight leader, Lieutenant Charles Taylor, yes, he was an experienced pilot overall, but he actually had a documented history of getting disoriented and lost, even in relatively good conditions. He'd done it before in the Pacific. And on that specific day, December 5th, 1945, the weather conditions offshore were actually poor. There were strong winds reported, rough seas below, making visual navigation really tricky, especially as evening approached. Critically, it seems both of his compasses malfunctioned. He thought he was over the Florida Keys, but he was likely far out over the Atlantic, east of Florida. And the planes were running low on fuel. That was a constant calculation on these long training missions. Radio communication was also becoming increasingly difficult. So Taylor's navigational errors, likely starting with his faulty compasses and his own disorientation, probably led the entire flight further and further off course, deeper into the open ocean, away from land, away from any reliable landmarks. In those worsening conditions, with fuel becoming critical and no clear idea where they were, ditching at sea becomes not just a possibility, but almost the inevitable outcome. And as for the search plane, the Martin Mariner PBM, well, those planes had a somewhat notorious nickname, the Flying Gas Tank. They were known to be vulnerable to catastrophic explosions due to fuel vapor buildup, especially around the engines. It's highly likely that the Mariner, searching frantically in the same poor weather, either succumbed to the severe conditions itself or suffered just such a catastrophic mechanical failure, like an in-flight explosion. It wouldn't be the first Mariner to do so. So the supernatural explanations, while they make for great stories, completely ignore the detailed Navy investigation that pointed directly to a combination of factors. Human error, specifically navigational error by the leader, instrument malfunction, deteriorating weather, low fuel, and potentially a known mechanical vulnerability in the search aircraft. It wasn't aliens, it was a devastating cascade of failures in a very challenging environment.
Wow. Okay, so Flight 19 sounds like a tragedy born of confusion and bad luck, not mystery. What about another really famous one? The USS Cyclops. That story always gives me chills. This was a huge Navy collier, basically a cargo ship, that vanished way back in March 1918. And it had a staggering 306 people on board, 306 souls. It was carrying a heavy load of manganese ore sailing from Brazil up to Baltimore, and it just disappeared. No distress signal, no wreckage found, nothing. An entire ship of that size with that many people just gone. It sounds impossible, like something out of a horror story.
It really does. And the loss of the USS Cyclops remains one of the single largest non-combat losses of life in U.S. Navy history. It's a profound tragedy. And you're right, no definitive wreckage has ever been found, which definitely fuels the mystery. However, looking back at the historical records, there are several very plausible, entirely non-supernatural explanations that emerge. Firstly, the ship itself was known to have some structural issues. It had apparently suffered engine damage on a previous part of the voyage. And carrying an extremely heavy, dense cargo like manganese ore puts immense stress on a ship's hull, especially if the cargo shifts in heavy seas. It's entirely possible, even probable, according to some maritime historians, that the Cyclops encountered an unforecasted, violent storm common in that area and suffered a rapid, catastrophic structural failure. It might have simply broken apart very quickly under the combined stress of the heavy, potentially shifting cargo and the powerful waves. If the breakup was sudden and total, there simply wouldn't have been any time to send out a distress signal. The ship would have gone down too fast. And this really touches on that point about unexplained versus undiscovered, doesn't it? When a large vessel sinks rapidly in very deep water, especially if it breaks up, finding identifiable wreckage becomes incredibly difficult, almost impossible without modern deep-sea search technology, which obviously didn't exist in 1918. The vastness and depth of the ocean are incredible concealing factors. So the lack of wreckage doesn't automatically point to the supernatural. It often just points to the limits of our ability to find things lost in the deep sea, especially decades later. A compromised ship meeting a sudden violent storm. Sadly, that's a scenario that has played out countless times in maritime history.
Okay, that makes sense too. Tragic, but understandable. And you mentioned a third case earlier, the SS Marine Sulphur Queen. Vanished in 1963. That sounds like another one often cited as proof.
Yes, the Marine Sulphur Queen. It provides another really stark, real-world example of how these things likely happen. The ship wasn't carrying ore, it was carrying molten sulfur, kept at incredibly high temperatures. A very unusual, very hazardous cargo. And again, like the Cyclops, investigations after its disappearance revealed that the ship was known to have significant structural weaknesses. It was an older vessel, converted for this specific, demanding purpose. The highly corrosive nature of the molten sulfur cargo itself could very well have further weakened the ship's hull and internal structures over time, making it incredibly vulnerable, especially in rough seas. When the ship disappeared, the most probable cause, according to Coast Guard investigations and maritime experts looking at its design and history, wasn't some mysterious external force. It was almost certainly a catastrophic structural failure. The vessel likely just broke apart under stress, possibly a sudden explosion related to the cargo, or the hull simply giving way. Again, older, potentially compromised ships carrying difficult cargo in challenging conditions. It's a recipe for disaster. The ocean, especially in storms, is just an unforgiving environment. It doesn't need aliens or time warps to claim a vessel when that vessel's already pushed to its limits by age, maintenance issues, design flaws, or the cargo itself. Right. So these iconic cases, Flight 19, the Cyclops, the Marine Sulphur Queen, they're consistently presented as these undeniable proofs of the triangle's weird power.
Yeah.
But when you dig into the details, the official reports, the historical context, they actually serve as perfect examples of how real-world factors, known risks, and logical explanations get completely sidelined when a more dramatic, supernatural story is available.
It really seems like when you actually look closely at the disappearances linked to the Bermuda Triangle, especially the ones we just talked about, this clear pattern starts to show up. A pattern that gets totally buried under all the sensational paranormal stuff. And that pattern points squarely at the huge, often downplayed, and tragically normal role of human error and mechanical failure. Just think about it logically for a second. We already established this region has incredibly heavy ship and air traffic, right? Well, basic statistics tell you that where there's more traffic, there are going to be more accidents. It's just numbers game. More cars on a highway means more potential for crashes. Same principle applies here. More ships and planes means inevitably more incidents will occur in that area compared to a really quiet, empty stretch of ocean.
Precisely. And what's crucial to remember is that pilot error, navigational mistakes, engine trouble, structural failures. These are common causes of accidents all over the world, on land, sea, and air. They happen everywhere. But in the Bermuda Triangle region, these everyday risks are amplified. They're compounded by those challenging environmental factors we discussed earlier, the sudden storms, the strong currents, the sheer distances involved if something goes wrong far from shore. Plus, consider that not every vessel or aircraft passing through this busy corridor is brand new or in perfect condition. You have older ships, maybe aircraft with less sophisticated navigation gear, vessels carrying heavy or potentially unstable cargo.
Right. So it makes you wonder, doesn't it? How many of these supposed mysterious vanishings could simply be down to something like an engine failing hundreds of miles from land, or a tired pilot making one critical mistake in a sudden blinding squall, leading to a situation that escalates incredibly quickly, becomes irrecoverable, and the ocean just takes the evidence. People often point to the lack of a distress signal as proof of something weird. But like you said with the Cyclops, if something catastrophic happens really fast, the ship breaks up, the plane disintegrates mid-air, there's just no time to send one. Silence doesn't automatically mean supernatural.
Exactly. Silence often just means speed and totality of the disaster.
Okay, so we've covered the history, the geography, the real dangers, the famous cases. But this deep dive wouldn't be complete if we didn't talk about the incredibly powerful engine that keeps the Bermuda Triangle legend alive and kicking. The media and pop culture. I mean, think about it. Books, Berlitz's bestseller being the prime example, but countless others too. Movies, TV shows, documentaries. They haven't just reported on the legend, they've actively fed it, amplified it, often presenting pure speculation and wild theories as if they were established facts. And this creates this really dangerous feedback loop, right? Any accident, any incident that happens even remotely within those loosely defined boundaries, regardless of the actual circumstances or what the evidence suggests, it gets automatically sucked into the myth. Public perception almost immediately jumps to, oh, another one for the triangle. It's like a default setting. You've heard it countless times in fiction, I'm sure. The Bermuda Triangle is just this cultural shorthand now for unexplained disappearance. It's a ready-made plot device for spooky stories.
It absolutely is. And you're right about that feedback loop. It highlights something really profound about how myths are sustained. And the digital age, well, that's just poured gasoline on the fire. The internet, social media platforms, forums, they provide this seemingly endless, often completely unmoderated space for conspiracy theories and supernatural explanations to breed and spread. These stories can go viral in minutes, reaching millions of people instantly, often completely divorced from any critical examination of the actual facts. And this whole phenomena taps into some really deep psychological needs we all have as humans, like our innate desire to find patterns and meaning, even in random events. Our brains are wired to look for connections, even when they aren't really there. Plus, let's face it, there's an undeniable appeal to mystery, to the unknown. And maybe there's even a strange kind of comfort in having simple, even if fantastical, explanations for things that are complex, frightening, or genuinely unexplained due to lack of evidence. Think about it from a human perspective. When terrible accidents happen, especially ones involving a lot of people, like Flight 19 or the Cyclops, people naturally crave answers. They want closure. And sometimes the cold, hard, scientific truth, structural failure due to poor maintenance or pilot disorientation in bad weather, it can feel, well, unsatisfying. It lacks drama. Maybe it feels too random, too mundane for such a huge tragedy. Supernatural explanations, even though they're not scientifically valid, can sometimes paradoxically offer a stronger sense of narrative closure, or at least a more dramatic, more compelling story than just an accident happened.
Yeah.
It also reflects our deep-seated fascination with danger, doesn't it? The allure of the unknown, that romantic, almost gothic idea of a place where the normal rules just don't apply.
Yeah, like a forbidden zone on the map.
Exactly. And ultimately, this ties into well-known cognitive biases, things like confirmation bias, where we actively seek out and believe information that confirms what we already suspect. If you believe the triangle is mysterious, you'll focus on the stories that support that. And the availability heuristic, where vivid, dramatic, easily recalled stories, like alien abduction, seem much more likely or frequent than they actually are compared to boring statistical facts about engine failure rates. So understanding this psychological angle, this media influence, it's absolutely crucial to understanding why. Why, despite decades of scientific debunking, the Bermuda Triangle story just won't die. Why it continues to fascinate generation after generation.
Okay, so after peeling back all those layers, the sensationalism, the history of the myth, the real dangers, the psychology, what do the hard facts actually say? What does rigorous scientific investigation tell us? You might actually be surprised by how clear, how definitive the scientific consensus really is. Over the years, numerous independent scientific investigations have been done by various reputable agencies, researchers, organizations. They've rigorously examined the claims about the Bermuda Triangle, the supposed high rate of disappearances. And they have consistently, without exception, come to the same critical, undeniable conclusion. The number of ship and plane losses in that region is not statistically higher than in any other similarly heavily traveled area of the ocean. When you account for the sheer volume of traffic, the accident rate isn't abnormal. It's just a plain statistical fact, backed up by decades of data.
Yeah, and this isn't just, a couple of obscure academic papers saying this. We're talking about reputable, authoritative bodies, organizations with direct, hands-on operational experience and financial stakes in that very region. They've weighed in unequivocally. Take the U.S. Coast Guard, for example. They are literally the ones responsible for search and rescue out there, day in, day out. They've stated publicly, repeatedly, for decades that there is absolutely no evidence to support the idea that the Bermuda Triangle is inherently more dangerous or mysterious than any other comparable part of the ocean. Their own excessive records, their operational experience, it all points to the same thing. They attribute the losses to the known hazards we've discussed, the weather, the currents, the vastness, combined with the simple, logical explanation. The huge volume of traffic, more ships, more planes, statistically means more accidents will happen there. It's probability, pure and simple, not paranormal activity. Like you said, it's no different than a busy highway having more accidents than a quiet country lane.
Right. The Coast Guard should know, if anyone does. And if that's not convincing enough on its own, just think about the cold, hard cash. Think about the economics of risk. Insurance companies, Lloyd's of London, outfits like that. Their entire business model is based on accurately calculating risk. They have a very direct, very bottom-line financial interest in knowing if one area of the ocean is genuinely, inexplicably riskier than another. They don't operate on myths or spooky stories. They operate on hardcore statistics and actuarial tables that determine premiums and potential payouts.
That's a really crucial point. If there truly was some kind of measurable, inexplicable, supernatural risk in the Bermuda Triangle, if ships and planes were genuinely vanishing there at an abnormally high rate for unknown reasons, you can bet your bottom dollar that the insurance premiums for any vessel or aircraft transiting that area would be significantly higher. They would reflect that unique, documented risk. But they don't. Marine and aviation insurance rates for traffic passing through the Bermuda Triangle are exactly the same as for other comparable, heavily trafficked ocean routes around the world. Insurers treat it as just another busy stretch of water with predictable, albeit sometimes severe, natural hazards. So that's the scientific reality, and it's backed up by the economic reality. The fact that the entities most directly impacted by actual risk governments running search and rescue, global insurers underwriting voyages, see nothing statistically unusual. That's perhaps the most compelling, most practical evidence you can find that the supernatural claims about the Bermuda Triangle are simply unfounded. And all these findings, they bring us right back around, full circle, leaving us with that really critical question about the real mystery here.
So we started this deep dive with those chilling stories, right? Tales of vanishing planes and ships, stories that have gripped us for decades, fueling this huge legend of supernatural danger out there in the Atlantic. You've now heard how that legend was actually born, how it was amplified over time. You've heard about the very real, very natural dangers of that specific part of the ocean. We've looked at the verifiable truth behind some of the most famous disappearances, and we've explored the powerful, often overlooked influence of simple human error, mechanical failure, the media hype machine, and even our own psychology.
And the evidence, when you really look at it objectively, it's pretty clear. While that region definitely presents real dangers, no question about it, extreme weather, powerful currents, the unforgiving nature of the sea, combined with the inevitable fallibility of humans and machines, there is absolutely zero credible scientific evidence to support the idea that the Bermuda Triangle is some kind of supernatural vortex, a paranormal danger zone where the laws of physics just break down.
Okay, so if the scientific explanations are actually pretty solid, If the debunking has been so thorough for so long, if the statistics show nothing truly unusual is happening there,
Yeah.
then what's left unsolved? What is the true mystery of the Bermuda Triangle?
Well, the real mystery, as I see it, isn't really about a specific vanishing ship or plane. Because, as we've seen, in the vast majority of cases where enough information exists, there are logical, even if tragic, explanations firmly within the realm of known factors. Human mistakes, equipment failure, terrible weather, the sheer power of the ocean. The true mystery is how this relatively straightforward collection of accidents, navigational errors, storms, and maybe a few genuinely unsolved cases due to lack of evidence. How did that become one of the most enduring, most captivating, most widely believed urban legends of our time? What does it really say about us, about the human psyche? Why do we seem to crave the extraordinary explanation? Why do we cling so tightly to the supernatural narrative, even when the ordinary, often just sad truth is readily available and much more grounded in reality?
Think about that for a moment. The most profound mystery isn't looking out there in the deep Atlantic, waiting to snatch another unsuspecting vessel. It's the incredible, enduring power of a story. A compelling narrative that takes hold, shapes our beliefs, shapes our perception, implants fear and wonder, even when all the available evidence points in a different direction. And maybe it's about how easily, how readily the human mind can take mundane, albeit often terrible, tragedy, and transform it into chilling, almost romantic legend. So the question we leave you with is this: what stories do you choose to believe? And maybe more importantly, why?